Okay, let's unpack this. We often hear about the triumph of liberal democracy after 1989, this global consensus around free markets and human rights. It's often painted as the end of history, like humanity had finally figured it all out, the ideal political system. But what if that victory actually ushered in something? Well, something new, but that looks strikingly like an old problem with a fresh coat of paint. What if, far from ending, empire simply evolved?
Exactly. And that's the really provocative argument at the heart of our deep dive today. We're looking at this, get to know the modern imperialists.
Hmm.
And it really challenges some core assumptions about how global power actually operates.
Right. The source material argues that this supposed triumph of liberal democracy, after the Berlin Wall fell, it wasn't an end to empires. Instead, it maybe opened the door to a new form, what the author calls liberal hegemony.
hmm And this is where, according to the essay, powers like the U.S. and its allies expanded their influence globally, not through, say, direct conquest like old empires, but by promoting specific liberal democratic norms, specific economic policies, often through interventions, military, political, economic, you name it.
And the author's central claim is pretty stark. These actions, often presented as altruistic, spreading democracy, they actually serve the geopolitical and economic interests of what the author calls intervening imperialist institutions, not necessarily nation states themselves, but these larger structures.
And in doing that, they impose a kind of one-size-fits-all model. That's the argument, which inevitably clashes with the diverse political realities and cultural identities on the ground.
So the author's mission with this essay, it's bold. They want to build an evolving list and description of these modern imperialist behaviors. They even mention Martin Luther's 95 Theses, aiming to spark a global debate.
And what gives it weight, I think, isn't just academic research. The author stresses it comes from personal experience, too. They mention being a citizen of South Africa, ancestors living there for 12 generations, seeing the effects of the new South Africa, the liberal world order, since '89 firsthand.
That personal lens adds a whole different dimension, grounding it in lived reality, not just theory.
Absolutely. And what's compelling is how the author immediately tries to deconstruct these familiar narratives. It's not about blaming, say, just liberalism or just capitalism. It's about identifying patterns of behavior that cut across ideologies, stripping away the rhetoric to see the mechanics of power, how control is exerted, how autonomy gets eroded.
And central to that whole framework is this concept they introduce, independent norm-forming communities.
Yes, exactly. Without understanding what that means, the rest of the argument doesn't quite click into place. It's the key.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means we're about to get a completely new lens, really, to view global power dynamics. We'll focus on how these actions impact what the author terms human agency, our collective ability to define ourselves, our way of life. Our mission today is to really understand these modern imperialist behaviors, first, by defining that key term, independent norm-forming communities, and then we'll systematically break down the 18 properties the author identifies, showing you exactly how these behaviors allegedly work to undermine those communities. Okay, let's start by really digging into this idea, this illusion of the end of history. After 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union dissolves. There was this huge sense, almost euphoria, right, that liberal democracy had won.
It was hailed as the definitive global triumph. The consensus was supposedly forming.
Hmm.
Free markets, human rights, political freedoms. That was the story.
But this essay challenges that head on. The author argues it wasn't an end at all. It was a shift, a rebranding almost. This ideological victory, they claim, actually ushered in a new, maybe more subtle form of imperialism disguised as liberal hegemony.
And that's the key insight, isn't it? What looked like freedom winning was maybe, according to this author, just a reframing of empire, just dressed in liberal clothes. If you think about the decades after '89, we saw liberal democratic powers, led often by the U.S. and its allies, actively expanding their influence. Well, by promoting their specific norms, their economic models, and often intervening elsewhere, militarily, politically, economically. The stated reason, the pretext, as the author puts it, was always spreading democracy, protecting human rights. Sounds good, right?
Of course, noble goals.
But the argument here is these actions weren't purely altruistic. They consistently served the geopolitical and economic interests of the intervening imperialist institutions themselves.
And that's a crucial distinction the author makes. It's not just nations vying for power, but these larger, maybe less visible imperialist institutions. And the result, paradoxically perhaps, was imposing this one-size-fits-all model of governance.
which often just didn't fit. It didn't align with the diverse political realities, the deep cultural identities of the people affected.
So instead of the promised creativity, harmony, freedom, the author suggests it actually led to instability because it caused the destruction of human agency through their right to become independent norm-forming communities. It's a shift from seeing these as helpful acts to seeing them as impositions.
Regardless of the intent, the outcome is the focus. And this leads us to the author's analytical approach,
Yeah.
which is powerful because it tries to go beyond ideology.
Right. They explicitly say they want to avoid the constraints of any single political label. Liberalism, communism, socialism, fascism, even nationalism when looking at imperialism. Why do that?
Well, it raises that important question you mentioned earlier. By stripping away the ideological justifications, the labels, the author forces us to look at the raw mechanics of power. It becomes about how control is exerted, how autonomy is chipped away, no matter what flag is flying or what philosophy is claimed.
And the author gives two main reasons for this broad approach. First, imperialism is incredibly adaptive, right? It can pop up under almost any political banner, changing its methods, its language to fit the context. But the goal remains some form of empire.
So by not tying the analysis to one ideology, the author hopes for a more versatile and comprehensive understanding of how these strategies work generically. It lets us see the underlying patterns, rather than getting bogged down in the specific political justifications used at the time.
And the second reason.
It builds on that. Focusing on the underlying actions and consequences rather than the justifying ideologies allows for a more objective and critical assessment. That objective lens is key to identifying the real characteristics, the real motives of imperialists across time and place.
And the ultimate aim.
It seems to be enabling a more effective critique, and maybe even inspiring new thinking. New, hopefully more ecology-centric ideologies, as the author puts it, something beyond the old frameworks, creating knowledge that isn't tied to dogma.
Which also brings up that interesting point about nationalism. The author notes it can be tricky. Nationalism can be an imperial construct, right? A tool empires use to unify or justify expansion.
Yeah, think of empires creating a national identity to rule diverse groups, or modern states using nationalism to justify intervention.
But it can also be, as the author says, a true container for actual independent norm-forming communities, a genuine expression of identity, a force for local autonomy.
Exactly. It can be both. So to avoid getting stuck in that ambiguity, the author deliberately focuses on imperialist behavior regardless of its ideology or containing social structures. It keeps the focus squarely on the actions that undermine self-determination, whatever the label or justification. It's a behavioral approach.
Okay, so before we dive into those 18 specific behaviors, we absolutely have to get clear on what the author means by an independent norm-forming community. Because if we don't grasp that, the whole argument about what's being targeted, it just won't land properly. We need to define the target to understand the strategy against it.
Precisely. The author sets these communities up as something distinct, something vital. They're contrasted with, say, simple individualism on one hand and empire on the other. Getting this definition right gives us the foundation to see what's supposedly being undermined.
So the core definition is a collective of individuals endowed with the inherent capacity, willingness, and dedication to autonomously create norms that frame and guide all dimensions of their communal existence. That's quite a mouthful, but it implies this deep-rooted belief in the power of collective human action free from external dictates.
It's about communities having the ability and the will to operate independently from these big, overarching structures, empires, quasi-imperial states that tend to impose standard ways of doing things. These communities are self-governing, self-defining, rooted in their own collective agency. They decide their own rules, maybe for local trade or education or governance, without needing outside permission.
And what about the individual within these communities?
The author presents the individual's role as central and multifaceted, and contrasts it sharply with what they call the dubious role individuals can play within the so-called liberal democratic hegemony. It introduces this idea of a spectrum coercion versus freedom, and where an individual chooses to align with the empire or with an independent community.
So freedom here isn't just like no one's forcing you physically.
Right. It's more than that. It's the presence of a nurturing environment where individual contributions to norm formation and internalization are valued and encouraged. Individualism here isn't isolation or being self-centered. It's about each member being empowered, but also responsible for contributing to the community's way of life, its ethos.
Like a town hall meeting where everyone's input genuinely shapes the outcome for that specific community.
Exactly. Contrast that with an empire, which the author says typically operates on a supercommunal hegemonic basis, always centralizing power, limiting the flexibility of the groups within it.
Whereas these independent communities foster governance that actually reflects and responds to the needs and dreams of their members, making it dynamic, adaptive.
Which is why the author emphasizes the importance of protected independent communities that can give life to new and revitalize old norms. It's about letting norms grow organically from the ground up, not just being dictated from the top down. It really challenges that traditional model.
So these communities represent a different way of organizing things, where collective ability and individual agency work together.
Yes, creating a self-sustaining, self-defining social order. They challenge those old binaries. Freedom versus coercion, empire versus individual. They propose a model where norms are deliberately and thoughtfully crafted by those they directly impact.
It sounds like it redefines community itself, championing autonomy, participation, respect for the individual within a, what does the author call it, a livable collective framework.
As opposed to the unlivable construct of a global ideological empire. That contrast is stark.
Okay, now here's where it gets really crucial, I think. The author makes this very sharp distinction between community and society, and it feels fundamental to the whole argument.
It absolutely is. It's not just semantics. It underpins why communities are targeted.
So first, community. The author uses the German Gemeinschaft, Afrikaans Gemeinschap, words that evoke connected shared life. Think close family, tight-knit neighborhood, maybe a traditional tribal group, deep bonds, shared understanding, unwritten rules.
A group sharing common characteristics and interests, and most of all unique norms, interacting for shared goals, often based on place, heritage, religion, or just a shared love that brings people together, an experience of living together.
And this is where an individual's deepest values, their existentially available norms, are most loved and most naturally incorporated. And communities can create societies based on their unique norms.
Then there's society.
Yeah.
German Gesellschaft, Afrikaans Gesellschaft. This is based more on the ability to talk together and make new knowledge and agreements. It's larger, more complex. Shared institutions based on mostly mechanistic agreements that flow from rational analysis.
Like a big city. Or the global economy. People interact, follow rules, make deals, but maybe without those deep personal bonds.
Exactly. It covers mostly market-related interactions, economic, legal systems. It does not expect the living togetherness and existential fulfillment that communities imply. It's more functional, transactional.
Okay, so what's the crucial implication here? Why make this distinction so sharp?
The author hammers this point. Independent norm forming should be focused on the community and not the larger society. Why? Because the community is where those deep, existentially available norms reside for individuals. Those norms are what people bring into society.
Ah, I see. So the community is the wellspring of these core norms.
Right. And this is why imperialists, according to the author, target communities. They get that if you undermine the community, the source of those living, breathing norms, you can then impose your own, often more transactional societal norms much more easily.
So if you want to control the city society, you first have to weaken or break down the families and neighborhoods, communities that give it its real character.
That seems to be the core logic presented. It's foundational. And it leads us straight into the how the 18 behaviors used to achieve this. Okay, so we've established what is supposedly being targeted, these independent norm-forming communities. Now, let's get into the how. The author lays out these 18 distinct strategies or properties, and as we go through them, you'll likely start seeing some unsettling patterns emerge.
Right. These aren't just random tactics, the argument goes. They form a coherent strategy aimed at undermining that very foundation of self-determining human groups.
Exactly. Let's start with the first one, which the author frames as the core motivation.
Fear of independent norm-forming communities.
Okay, Property 1 states, imperialists fear independent norm-forming communities most because it is the only legitimate orchestration of human intentions able to break free from their empire. That is why they prevent independent norm-forming communities as a matter of highest priority.
This really sets the stage. The core idea is that imperial powers see these communities as a fundamental threat. Why? Because they represent a legitimate alternative. They have the capacity to orchestrate human intentions in a way that could genuinely break free from imperial control, disrupt the hegemony.
Their very existence is a challenge.
Their ability to self-define, to set their own course, directly contradicts a centralized power structure. So suppressing them becomes the highest priority. It's preemptive. You stop the alternative from even taking root. It's about preventing that blueprint for freedom, as you said earlier.
Makes sense. If that's the core fear, then the next behaviors start showing the tactics used to dilute or control them.
Forcing communities into globally sovereign states.
Priority 2 described how. Imperialists will try to force independent norm-forming communities into a globally sovereign state that has such a wide range of different communities, languages, and tribes, all ruled through the same sovereign state, that it by definition makes it extremely difficult to harmonize relationships between independent norm-forming communities. This makes the terms nation and nation-state meaningless in essence.
Yeah, this is like a macro-level divide and conquer. Imperial powers, the author argues, often push diverse independent communities into one single state structure, one that they recognize. Think about colonial borders drawn on a map, lumping disparate groups together.
Right, often ignoring the actual communities on the ground.
Exactly. And the design, often deliberately, includes such a wide mix of communities, languages, tribes, that genuine harmony, organic relationships between these communities become incredibly difficult. Maybe impossible.
So it makes the whole idea of a nation or nation-state based on shared identity kind of meaningless.
That's the argument. It's no longer based on a real integrated Gemeinschaft, that shared community feeling, but on an imposed Gesellschaft structure. It suppresses local self-determination and stops cohesive identities from forming that might resist the empire.
Using multiculturalism as a melting pot.
Okay, building on that, Property 3 talks about culture. Imperialists will use multiculturalism as a melting pot to dissolve independent norms and cultures made by independent communities into subservient communities, instead of allowing other cultures to be experienced through trusted and natural interactions between communities. The imperialist expectation is that all norms must become homogenized to whatever their dictates demand.
This one's subtle. It suggests imperialists co-opt the idea of multiculturalism. Instead of genuinely celebrating difference, they turn it into a melting pot strategy. The goal isn't preserving diversity, but eroding distinct norms, diluting unique cultures into a homogenized framework that fits the empire's goals.
So it's the opposite of real cultural exchange, where communities interact, learn from each other, but keep their distinctiveness.
Precisely. Instead of that organic, trust-based interaction, this strategy pushes for cultural conformity. Everyone's norms should blend into whatever the imperial center dictates. It diminishes autonomy and the richness that comes from genuine diversity interacting naturally. It's cultural control through dilution, essentially.
Destroying civilizations, supporting independent communities.
Property 4 sounds much more direct, even aggressive. Imperialists try to destroy any civilization that successfully and actively supports and protects independent norm-forming communities, because such a civilization will never be conducive to lasting empires, but can be called a commonwealth of communities in a dynamic balancing alliance sphere.
This highlights a critical point for the author. True diversity, rooted in autonomous communities, is just fundamentally incompatible with a centralizing empire. Civilizations that genuinely nurture these independent communities, that create an ecology of them, what the author calls a commonwealth, a dynamic alliance, they inherently resist imperial control.
So they become targets.
Yes. Imperialists, according to this view, will actively target such civilizations, from inside and outside. To stop this alternative model, a dispersed power structure, from emerging or succeeding, it's not just about controlling the present, but preventing alternative futures where power isn't centralized.
Okay, so we have fear, dilution, direct attack on supportive structures. What about the economic side? How is that used?
Maintaining a monetary system for transactional trust.
Property 5 gets into economics. Imperialists will set up and maintain a monetary system that supports transactional trust at the expense of independent norm-forming communities in favor of imperial ruling elites and the anti-community institutions they use for wealth creation, assuming that intended community behavior in actuality becomes normalist consumerist behavior that safeguards their monetary influence and power.
This is about how economic systems themselves can be weaponized. The argument is that imperialists create and maintain monetary systems that primarily support imperial transactional trust, Think global finance, big international corporations. These systems disproportionately benefit the imperial elites and the institutions they use to make wealth.
And this comes at the expense of the local communities.
Yes. While presented as neutral, the system evolves into anti-community behavior. The author uses this striking image, aiming to turn individuals into zombified individuals as the base economic actor, basically reducing people to normless consumers, driven by economic signals, disconnected from deeper community ties or unique values, just cogs in the global machine.
That's quite a picture. So the financial structures reinforce imperial power.
The flow of capital is designed, consciously or not, to pull wealth out of local community systems, making it hard for them to build their own economic strength. It's described as a calculated effort to prevent alternative community-based economies from challenging the main imperial system.
That idea of the zombified economic actor is chilling. How does this connect to military power or global order?
Framing WMDs as legitimizing imperial aspirations.
Property 6 talks about weapons of mass destruction. Imperialists will frame weapons of mass destruction as a legitimizing factor for their imperial aspirations, instead of using the ability to wield ultimate force to safeguard the dynamic balancing alliance sphere where independent norm-forming communities thrive.
This suggests a manipulation of fear and power on a grand scale. Imperial powers strategically use the existence of WMDs to legitimize their own ambitions. They might use the threat or the supposed need to control them to justify interventions, dictate global rules, maintain their specific world order.
Instead of using that power differently?
Right. Instead of using that ultimate force to protect a genuine balanced alliance sphere, a space where different independent communities could actually flourish and cooperate safely, they use it to increase their own dominance. By framing WMDs as necessary for their kind of security, they obscure the possibility that these weapons could, ironically, be used to protect a more diverse, equitable system where independent communities play a stabilizing role.
Okay, so we've touched on structural, cultural, economic, and military aspects. What about manipulating people more directly, individuals, leaders?
Breeding independent individuals to destroy communities.
Property 7 is quite provocative. Imperialists don't fear independent individuals who have no real community bonds. In fact, they breed them through internationalist institutions in order to control and use them to destroy independent norm-forming communities whom they fear most.
This is described as a really insidious strategy. Imperial powers actively cultivate individuals without strong community ties, often through things like international NGOs, certain global education programs, maybe even global media narratives.
And the purpose is twofold.
Yes. First, it extends the empire's reach. But second, and maybe more disturbingly, it deploys these disconnected individuals as tool to undermine those very independent communities that are seen as the real threat. Promoting an individualism detached from community weakens the social fabric, the collective resilience needed to resist. It makes people less likely to form alliances that challenge the status quo. It's about disconnecting people from their collective strength.
Coercing, enticing leaders into internationalism.
Oh, and that leads into Property 8, focusing on leaders. Imperialists will use various means of coercion and enticement to draw established and emerging leaders from independent norm-forming communities to become internationalists. Instead of building the real prestige of their own communities, they build the prestige of an empire.
This is presented as a direct brain drain, a siphoning off of leadership. Imperial powers use carrots and sticks, coercion, and enticement to pull leaders away from their home communities. They're drawn by promises of influence, prestige, opportunities on the global stage. They're persuaded to adopt an internationalist perspective, prioritizing the empire's goals over their own community's needs.
So it strips the community of its leaders.
Exactly. And redirect their talents towards building the empire's prestige, not their own communities. It undermines autonomy and drains the very talent needed for self-determination. It's like cutting the head off the local body in a way.
Forcing internationalist investments' corporate behaviors.
This connects back to the economy. Property 9 says, imperialists will always force investments and corporate behaviors to be internationalist, instead of allowing wealth creation to be the consequence of enterprises in and between independent norm-forming communities.
It reiterates how economic power gets centralized. Imperial powers enforce investment rules, corporate behaviors that follow internationalist lines, deliberately suppressing local economic autonomy. Think about pressures for deregulation, opening markets to global players, adopting global financial standards, even when it doesn't suit the local context.
So wealth generation ends up serving the broader imperial interests, not necessarily flowing organically within or between communities.
That's the core idea. It stifles the potential for communities to build their own economic landscapes, manage their own resources. The wealth gets redirected, preventing alternative networks from forming outside imperial control.
It really paints a picture of trying to dismantle internal cohesion from multiple angles. What other ways are communities undermined from within?
Actively promoting suboptimal communities.
Property 10 sounds quite cynical. Imperialists will actively promote all forms of suboptimal communities because in aggregate it will undermine the probability for it to endure and grow into lasting, independent, norm-forming communities.
Yeah, this is presented as a strategy of calculated weakness. Imperial powers might strategically support or encourage the proliferation of suboptimal, maybe dysfunctional or fragmented community structures. Why? Because they recognize that these weak entities lack the resilience, the cohesion to ever become strong, independent, norm-forming communities.
So fostering weakness prevents strengths from emerging.
That's the logic described. It destabilizes the foundations,
Right.
fostering disunity, inefficiency. It dilutes their potential strength, making them less likely to challenge the empire, ensuring they remain dependent or subservient. It's like deliberately planting weeds, as you said, to stop the strong plants from taking root.
Using universalist identity politics as a virus.
Now, Property 11 gets really interesting, turning a critical eye on identity politics. Imperialists use some universalist claims of identity politics as a virus that turns individuals into victim zombies programmed to destroy independent, norm-forming communities.
This is a really controversial claim in the essay. It suggests that certain universalist claims within identity politics can be weaponized, used as tools to fragment communities. The idea is that individuals can become programmed almost to prioritize personal, often disconnected identity grievances over the collective well-being or autonomy of their actual lived community.
And so it sows internal division, turns people against their own communal structures.
That's the risk highlighted. Internal divisions, conflicts, distract from forming cohesive units capable of resisting external influence or building their own shared future. It's presented as a way to destabilize from within, using identity itself against the community.
Using utopian ideologies, religions, to invalidate independence.
Property 12 continues this theme of ideological manipulation. Imperialists will use the universal truth claims taught by utopian ideologies, religions, and theological convictions like atheism to invalidate the independence of norm-forming communities instead of allowing religion and other theological convictions to guide and connect independent norm-forming communities.
This points to a kind of intellectual or spiritual control. Imperial powers exploit the universal truth claims found in various systems. Religions, big ideologies like capitalism or communism, even atheism. How? By using these claims to undermine the autonomy of local communities. They craft narratives suggesting local norms, local values are somehow inferior or opposed to these bigger, supposedly universal truths.
So it delegitimizes the local.
Right. It diminishes the validity of the community's own traditions, their own ways of understanding the world, and it prevents these deep belief systems from actually serving as a source of unity or connection between communities. Instead of guiding and connecting, these convictions get repurposed, the author argues, as tools for division and control, stifling independence.
Using science as universally normative authority.
And Property 13 tackles science, which is often seen as objective. Imperialists will use the universal aspects of science and some conflated scientific interpretations of data as universally normative authority to destroy independent, norm-forming communities. Instead of using the amazing diversity and durability observed in nature to validate the social ecology of independent, norm-forming communities, imperialists reduce humans to bacteria-like, atomized utility optimizers.
This raises that critical question. When scientific insights get used not just to understand but to impose a single worldview, what happens to human diversity? The argument is that imperial powers leverage science's authority, but selectively interpret data to undermine local communities. They present certain findings as universally normative, a kind of monolithic amoral truth that overrides local ways of knowing.
Instead of seeing diversity in nature as maybe validating diverse human societies.
Exactly. Instead of seeing nature's resilience and diversity as a model for social ecology, the author claims imperialists manipulate science to centralize control, push a homogenized standard, and that stark image again, reducing humans to bacteria-like atomized utility optimizers. Just isolated units focused on efficiency, stripped of their rich social and cultural context.
Wow. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. How are seemingly positive things like welfare or justice supposedly used as tools?
Using welfare to invalidate independence.
Property 14 looks at welfare. Imperialists will use welfare to invalidate the independence of norm-forming communities instead of allowing fair play, work, and thrift to secure and develop independent norm-forming communities.
This suggests even aid can be a tool of control. Imperial powers might strategically use welfare policies to undermine autonomy. How? By positioning external aid as essential for survival, they subtly erode self-reliance, internal governance. They create dependency.
So it invalidates the community's own ability to manage itself through its own values, like fair play, work, thrift.
That's the argument. Instead of helping communities build robust internal economies or social structures based on their own principles, welfare, in this view, becomes a control mechanism. It discourages the very self-sufficiency that would lead to real independence. It's like that helping hand that keeps you down.
Overbearing care justice to take away will to toil.
Property 15 sounds similar, maybe even more insidious. Imperialists focus their overbearing sense of caring and justice on taking away communities' will to toil for sustained, independent norm forming and togetherness.
Imperialists might cloak interventions in this language of exaggerated concern, overbearing care, and justice. But this benevolent-sounding approach, the author argues, strategically erodes the community's own drive, their will for self-determination. By constantly implying external oversight is necessary for their well-being, it diminishes the local will to do the hard work, the collaboration needed to build and sustain their own norms, their own togetherness.
Making them reliant, less likely to push back.
Exactly. They become passive recipients of the empire's care, rather than active agents in their own future.
Implementing human rights as individual, not community rights.
Property 16 is a challenging one for many. Imperialists will implement human rights only as individual rights and not as community rights, with the individual rights aimed at destroying independent norm-forming communities in favor of an internationalism of isolated individuals.
Yeah, this identifies a specific way human rights frameworks can be implemented. The argument is that imperialists systematically prioritize individual rights, often deliberately at the expense of community rights. This isn't just about valuing the individual. It's presented as a calculated strategy to weaken independent communities by fragmenting their social fabric.
How does that work?
By shifting the focus entirely away from communal needs and priorities towards purely individual ones' rights that might isolate people from their community context. It promotes this internationalism of isolated individuals. It dilutes collective action, erodes the foundation for shared norms and community autonomy. It's presented as an intentional undermining of community rights to break collective power.
Conflating global justice with togetherness to legitimize empire.
Property 17 points to a kind of rhetorical trick. Imperialists skillfully conflate a globalized notion of justice with the concept of togetherness to legitimize their empire, presenting their dominion as a benevolent unification of diverse entities.
This is about using language to legitimize control. Imperialists cleverly merged this idea of global justice with the warm feeling of togetherness. Why? To make their empire seem like a good thing, a benevolent force unifying everyone. But this diverts attention, the author argues, from the real potential for togetherness, which would come from security and cooperation within and between genuinely independent communities.
So they promote their version of universal justice, which happens to align with their interests.
Precisely. And it overshadows the more complex reality of how local and universal values could actually work together to foster real collaboration. It centralizes power in the empire and discourages organic solidarity between communities. It makes empire sound like one big happy family while undermining actual families and communities.
Monopolizing personal search for understanding.
And finally, property 18. This feels very relevant today. Imperialists will monopolize your personal search for understanding to ensure that you don't trust your own independent norm-forming community's socialization of understanding and knowledge.
This goes right to the heart of how we know things are epistemology. The argument is that imperial powers systematically try to control the channels through which we seek understanding. Education, media, information flow. The goal: to make us rely on their narratives, their ways of seeing the world, rather than the wisdom, the knowledge, the understanding developed within our own communities.
So it undermines trust in our own local ways of knowing.
By monopolizing these channels, they aim to undermine trust in local socialization processes, local knowledge creation. It isolates individuals from their community roots, making them less capable of independent thought, independent action, and more susceptible to imperial influence. It's described as a battle for your mind, essentially. A battle over whether you trust your community's understanding or the external narrative. Tagged out retro.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot to take in. 18 distinct properties, painting a picture of modern imperialism focused not just on land or resources, but on undermining the very ability of communities to define themselves. This deep dive has really tried to illuminate these complex, subtle forms of control, moving beyond just military conquest to the systemic erosion of independent norm-forming communities.
And the author's essay, as we've seen, isn't just an analysis. It's a call for debate, for creating new knowledge to critically assess these behaviors.
So what does this all mean for you, listening? If modern imperialism operates through these kinds of subtle yet powerful strategies that the author describes, how does that change the way you look at global news? Or economic trends, or even what's happening in your own local community? It's like putting on a new pair of glasses, isn't it? Things might look quite different.
It really raises that fundamental question the author keeps circling back to. They posit that destroying human agency, destroying these communities, leads to instability. If we accept that premise, even just hypothetically, then maybe fostering and protecting these independent norm-forming communities isn't just a nice idea. Maybe it's the most vital thing for genuine creativity, harmony, and freedom.
It certainly challenges us to look beneath the surface of claims about universal benefits or progress and ask, who benefits and what's the underlying intent? Is it fostering organic norms or imposing external ones?
Maybe true stability comes from that ground-up, organically formed norm structure.
So the final thought maybe is this. How might understanding these dynamics, these 18 properties we've discussed, empower you? Empower you to distinguish between genuine community building, efforts that strengthen local agency, and those forces, however subtle, that seek to homogenize or control. What small steps, perhaps, can anyone take to nurture the unique norms, the agency within their own communities? The answer, as this essay suggests, might lie in valuing the local, the shared, the truly independent, recognizing that quiet strength and self-determination. Something to think about.